Hey everybody, it's Thunder again. I want to talk about disobedience today, a mental revolution. I was thinking about some of the things I said the other day and how I admonished people that, hey, you have to do something. You can't just be complacent. And so I started thinking about a lot of different things. One of the things I was thinking about was civil disobedience. And another thing I was thinking about was the 60s and some of the things that the other people and myself did in the 60s as far as civil disobedience. And then I started thinking about revolution and the difference between revolution, civil disobedience, that type of thing. And also I thought about different forms of government like democracy, anarchy, socialism, all that type of thing. Now, it's really hard for me to know where to begin, and I may pause this video because I have some notes here that I have to look at in order for me to be coherent. But just let me mention a few things off the top of my head. Now, there were people that were very active in the past in forming an act of civil disobedience. Not just disobedience, but civil disobedience. And every great movement had a great leader. And so one of the great leaders was Gandhi, okay, who performed different acts of civil disobedience and also advised that they be performed. And then another one was Martin Luther King and others in the era of what we call, quote unquote, the 60s, which was really not just the 60s but also went into the 70s. So the 60s is just a generic term. And I remember the 60s well. I was there, yes. And I committed several acts of civil disobedience. In fact, I was arrested many, many times, and I was also, I guess they would call it abused, tortured, whatever. Now, I just want people to know that those many, many times that I was arrested don't even show up on my history. I mean, I'm sure they're there somewhere, but I am basically clean as a citizen as far as laws go or records go. But most of the stuff they did back then was under the radar. For instance, I can remember doing a sit-in with a black friend of mine, staying in a restaurant when we were told to leave, and basically it was because he was black, and we refused to leave, and we sat and we just kept drinking coffee and talking, and eventually the manager, who I think was from the South, called the police, and the police showed up and ordered us to leave, and we refused to leave. And so they took us out, handcuffed us, threw us in the back of a cop car, and took us to jail. And they weren't very friendly in doing this, needless to say. Next day I was out, okay, because they really had no reason to keep us in there except that it was basically just for harassment purposes. And I won't go into the many other times in the 60s that I and others committed acts of civil disobedience, and it was for the Vietnam War, and it was for civil rights, and it was for basically the system the way it was then. Now, you know, I'm touching on this because I think that all of this stuff has basically been forgotten for the most part. I mean, yes, there are movements here and there, but let me mention a movement that many people might not know about from the 60s. And it happened on November 15th, 1969. And it's clear in my memory. And it was the moratorium march or demonstration on Vietnam. And guess what? 1,000,000 people showed up in Washington. And they did such things as wearing signs around their neck of people that had died in the Vietnam War, and then they went in front of the White House and screamed that name at the White House. And then they proceeded to march to a different location near the White House where they had these wooden pine boxes or caskets or whatever you want to call them lined up, and they put each name in there. Now, that was one way to show civil disobedience to a war. And then Gandhi had his ways that he did it. And there's always been this big dispute about, well, is it violent or nonviolent? Or what is best, violence or nonviolence? What is the best way to accomplish things? Well, let me tell you, all of these demonstrations had a component of violence to them. Now, it usually started on the other side of the ones that were being protested against, i.e. the government. And a lot of people were killed. And in Gandhi's demonstrations, a lot of people were killed, over 1,000, maybe thousands. And people were killed in the demonstrations in the 60s. You have Kent State, for example, and if you want to talk about deaths in the 60s, there were plenty of them. But people realize the importance of civil disobedience. And I call civil disobedience a mental revolution. In other words, it's a revolution in thought, okay? And many people like Martin Luther King and Henry David Thoreau and just a lot of thinkers, a lot of people that were thinkers, and a lot of people that realized injustice were involved in these movements. And I have some quotes here that I'm going to pull up now. Here's one from Henry David Thoreau, Civil Disobedience and Other Essays. Quote, "If the machine of government is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law." Here's one by Martin Luther King, Jr. "I became convinced that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good." Now, for a second here, I want to jump over to another phase or another component of this, I want to talk about governments and social orders and politics. Now, there's a word called democracy. And democracy basically means that the people rule. And how the people rule is been or has been decided that the people rule in this government and in some others by voting or by having a representative. That's one way of democracy, is by having a representative somewhere in Congress or whatever. And then another way is by direct democracy, which means by the people with no intermediary. Isn't when you look at the way things are done nowadays politically, there is no true democracy. Democracy is not happening. Okay, not directly, not indirectly. No way is it happening, because all the people that are supposedly represented by these other people, the other people are being bought off, and those other people are politicians. They're basically shysters and liars and non-leaders. So anarchy is another term that I want to discuss, and people right away go, oh my God, anarchy, that's just, you know. Well, the true meaning of anarchy means no government. And of course they always make these words seem bad, you know. And I'm not like advocating anarchy, I'm not advocating anything. All I'm here to do is inform and make people enlightened as to what different things mean. Anarchy means a rule civilly by people. In other words, no government, but maybe citizens groups organizing to accomplish certain things like policing and that type of thing. So in a way, that's a form of government too. So basically, you have different forms of government, different belief systems. But the bottom line is, how is it affecting you as a person? Are you a free spirit? And if you're not a free spirit, do you have the right to complain, the right to disobey, the right to speak your mind, the right to move around freely in this realm? Yes, you do. You absolutely do. There is no question about it. Just being born and being a spiritual physical being that we are, we have that right. So people ask me, well, what do I do? What can I do to stop this? Think about it. Think about civil disobedience or disobedience. Think about what would happen for 1 minute if a lot of people all at the same time, like they did in the 60s, decided, no, this isn't what I believe in, this isn't me, this isn't freedom, this isn't being a free spirit, this is diametrically opposed. I don't believe in war, I don't believe in my money going for war, I don't believe in, you know, unjust laws that subjugate me. I don't believe in being a slave to the system. I don't believe in any of these things that are represented by this cozy little fraternity, that's been formed by the powers to be. And that's a term that I use a lot, the powers to be. Whoever the powers to be are, whether it's the people behind the politicians or the politicians themselves, or the people that have this agenda for mankind, the only way that you're going to change things is to be disobedient to laws that are unjust. And I don't believe in laws anyway, because the Native American didn't have laws. I mean, not like we have them today. They had moral laws or moral concepts or moral belief systems, but they were spiritual. There's nothing spiritual about what's going on today. Nothing at all. It's absolutely gone awry. There are no great leaders. There are no moral leaders. There are no spiritual leaders. Because like the I Ching says, when the evil are in power, the people suffer. So, people are suffering. And I touched on this in my last talk that I gave. And don't think that this will be the last. I mean, I will continue this on as long as I can. Now, another thing that I wanted to touch on here is, and why it's imperative to disobey or to turn your back on certain practices by people that are considered to be, by many definitions, evil or psychotic, or rulers that are ruling not in the best interests of the majority of mankind. But one thing that I want to touch on here is that it is imperative, okay, to have that option to say no, to be a free spirit, to be completely free of any kind of subjugation, and to be able to think for oneself. Now, to get back to a thought I had earlier, when we disobeyed in the 60s, or whenever there was disobedience, it usually surrounded oppression, and oppression by some sort of government or armed force, or some kind of oppression. And the results of that oppression, and the results of that manifesting in ways such as war, or sending people off to war to be killed. And in Vietnam and in the 60s, it was about that. And it was about us being able to make our own choices. Because you got to remember, most of the people that were in the 60s that were of my age were, grew up with this threat of nuclear annihilation. So that was kind of an inspiring factor. Now look at what we have today. Look at what we have today. We have something that is exponentially 100, maybe 1,000 times worse than in the 60s. And that is extinction of mankind. Not just nuclear, but I'm talking about extinction of mankind. The planet will always be here, but will it be barren, or will it be like it always has been before mankind tampered with it? These are moral questions These are questions of the morality of extinction. It's hard for me to get that word out, extinction, believe me, because it's not something you like to think about. But my point being is, when you talk about extinction, when you talk about the planet being ruined, when you talk about everybody being under some type of subjugation worldwide, and the wars that we have today and the killing that we have today and the stuff that we have today really makes the Vietnam War and that whole era pale in comparison. And yet, what are people doing? Are they getting out? Are they performing acts of civil disobedience? Are there 1 million, 2 million people? There should be 2 million. There should be 3 million people. I say on this November 15th we have 3 million people. That's what I say. Or any day, but that would be a good day since the Vietnam moratorium fell on that day. But anyway. And if you like this video, share it with everybody. Make it go viral. I have important things to say, and I'm not here to waste my breath. Believe me. And when I say these important things, who's to know whether it's putting me in harm's way? But I'm a warrior, okay? Which brings up another point about civil disobedience, whether it has to be peaceful, whether there's always been discussion about that. I mean, of course, like Sun Tzu's Art of War says, you start by trying to be peaceful, by trying to have reason with, and then if you can't reason, well then you disobey, and if you disobey, then it's liable to anger the other side. But if it's in such massive forces where there's millions of people, what are they going to do? Arrest everybody? Kill everybody? Hardly. And if they do, or if they try to, there is no law. In fact, the moral law is, and this is my personal opinion, okay, is that you have a right to protect yourself and your family regardless, okay? So you start off peacefully and you start off with civil disobedience and you see what happens. And if it escalates by the other side into some type of them trying to harm you, well then your options are pretty obvious, aren't they? Your options are you can protect yourself. And see, this is a revolution of thought, really. I mean, it might manifest on a physical level, but it's a revolution of thought. That's what it's supposed to be about. A revolution of change, because a normal quote-unquote revolution is to overthrow a government. And there's been a lot of people that have done that in the past, like Che Guevara and Castro. You know, they overthrew the dictator of Cuba, and then they took over, and then they became dictators, and then you're just replacing one government with another government in a revolution. You're overthrowing a government and you're bringing in a new government. That's not what we want. Governments don't work. Think about it. Have they ever worked? Because the people in power, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we don't want that. What we want is a true governance, or a true society where people are the ones that govern. We don't need a government. I mean, did the Native Americans need a government? Did the tribes have a government? Well, they had a council. Okay? They had a council, and when there were problems or situations that arose, they formed the elders together, and these people were wise men and women. And they smoked the chinumpa, the sacred pipe, and they sat down around the fire. People like Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, others, Red Cloud, all of these people. And they talked about the situation, and they each voiced a wise opinion. And they spoke straight. They didn't lie. And they made suggestions. Okay? If a person came to them with a problem, each person on the council made a suggestion. And it was always a type of thing where a suggestion was either taken or not taken. It was up to that person. There were no rules, there were no laws regarding, well, if you don't do this, we're going to throw you in jail. Now, that's more my type of government, which is no government. It's basically, you know, a shepherding. How do you describe it? It's almost impossible to describe because it's so far removed from what we have today. Of a bunch of people in suits and ties and stiff collars. You know, they ought to take those ties and kind of like hang them by the ties. And they're murderous people. And they don't have any scruples. And they're greedy. And they're suppressive. And oppressive. They suppress your true being. Now this is all in the duality. And what did Krishna say to Arjuna? Well, it's all into the duality, so do what you got to do. Do what you got to do. There's different ways to disobey. There's different ways to say no. You don't have to be a puppet. You don't have to be a puppet on a string. You do not have to do that. Get it through your head. And so start with a mental revolution in your head about, gee, you know what? Thunder's right. I really do not have to do certain things. Because whether you do those things or don't do those things, the outcome probably won't be much different. Excepting for the fact that you're a free spirit when you don't do them. And that's a form of taking the pressure off, realizing your oneness with the cosmos, your oneness with Great Spirit, your oneness with your fellow man. I mean, this is the best I can offer right now as far as advice. Is that you don't have to do what you're told. I never in my life accepted things that I felt were wrong. Sometimes I was called rebellious. Sometimes I was called a black sheep. Sometimes I was called this. Sometimes I was called that. These are all just words that other people put on you to make you feel bad about being free. Just like they did with Geronimo and Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and all the other great leaders, the only leaders that I can think of that were great, that were just, that were looked at for their true track record, not from what they blabbed out of their mouth. Oh, you know, some of these people are great orators. They can speak eloquently, and everything that comes out of their mouth is a lie. Doesn't matter whether it sounds good or not. It's the actions. So, my answer to the question that some people ask me is, sorry, got a phone call there. Guess I'll get back to it later. Sorry about the interruption. But anyway, let me pause here for a minute. Someone trying to call me, that happens a lot. What can I say? So, I think I'll end this video anyway. Maybe that was a sign. But I just want to say, think about some of the things that I said, and think about what it means to be complacent and not do anything, as opposed to doing something. Because just remember, if you do something, it's going to affect them. And if you do something that hits them in the pocketbook, if it hits them in a place where they no longer have control over you. And this applies to anybody. It applies to governments, people, things, religion, like I said before. It's a talk about disobedience, and that isn't such a bad word. Because if you obey a law or a person or a thing that is evil, then you're evil. You're taking part in it. You're complicit in it. So it's a matter of your own free spirit, your own conscience, your own belief system. And whatever your belief system is, I hope it's that you're not complicit in acts of evil and acts of murder and acts of course, we're all complicit in a way because we pay taxes and that's what they do with them. So there's a good place to start. Non-compliance with all kinds of laws and all kinds of collection processes that take your money and use it for things that you don't want it to be used for. So anyway, I want to just mention Spirit of Crazy Horse. That's my website, and it's right beneath this video in the About section down there. You can click on the link, go to Spirit of Crazy Horse. My book, Listen to the Wind, Speak from the Heart, is there. Also my book, Emergence. And that's talking about emergence as in a reforming of the world, along with it being a novel. And then the newsletter and the donation button where you can make an offering or a gift, which will help me pay for the internet and the other things that I have to use to keep this show going. Otherwise, who knows though? I may decide to just stop at some point, or they might carry me away. But whatever the thing, whatever happens, happens, So I want to say that I have great love for you all, and I concern for you all. And I want to just say blessings and love to you all. And this is Thunder. I'm out of here. Take care.